Snow drifted across the wide, empty plain, soft as ash falling from a dying fire. The small town at the edge of the valley lay hushed beneath the weight of winter, its wooden storefronts weather-beaten and its boardwalks creaking from years of boots and wagon wheels. Life here had always been hard, but for a widow, it was near impossible. Folks whispered about her behind closed doors and across bar counters, saying she was too proud, too cold, too stubborn to let any man close again. Every ranch hand, farmer, and storekeeper who had tried his hand at winning her had been turned away with the same quiet steel in her eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty was a dangerous thing out here, especially when wrapped in a soul that refused to bend. She had once known love, deep and fierce, the kind that tied itself into your bones and made the rest of the world disappear. But death had cut that rope without mercy, leaving her alone to face long winters and endless chores. Men came knocking with good intentions, offering warm homes, steady incomes, and the promise of company. She would shake her head and close the door, her heart unyielding. The town grew used to it. Some pitied her, some judged her, and some secretly admired the way she stood on her own when most women would have remarried for survival's sake. Yet no one dared to press too hard. She was a woman carved by grief and grit, and she wore both like armor. Then, one gray morning, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. A rider appeared on the horizon, tall in the saddle, his dark coat flapping against the wind. He wasn't a man anyone recognized, and in towns like this, strangers were seldom welcomed easily. Yet there was something in the way he rode, steady and sure, like he carried no fear of what lay ahead. His horse moved with the power of the open range, kicking up snow and steam as though they had traveled far without rest. By the time he reined in at the edge of town, people had already gathered, eyes narrowing with curiosity. Strangers meant stories, and stories meant trouble or change. Often both. The widow stood on her porch, wrapped in a worn shawl, her breath rising in clouds against the cold air. She hadn't meant to watch, but something about the figure drew her gaze. The stranger swung down from the saddle, tall and broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat shadowing a face hardened by road and weather. He tied his horse, then lifted his head. Their eyes met. It was just a glance, a passing look across the snow-filled street, but it struck her like a hammer to glass. For the first time in years, her resolve trembled. She did not move. She did not breathe. She only stared, caught in the weight of something she could not name. The townsfolk whispered, watching him with suspicion. Some said he looked like an outlaw. Others muttered that he carried himself like a soldier who'd seen too much war. The saloon doors swung open, and men leaned against the posts, sizing him up the way they would a poker hand. He ignored them all. His eyes lingered on the widow just long enough to leave a mark she could not shake. Then he turned away, pushing through the snow toward the inn. No words had been spoken, no promises made, yet something had shifted in the air. Sharp and undeniable. That night, the widow sat by her fire, staring into the flames while her mind replayed that single glance again and again. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of loneliness and cold weather. But deep down, she felt it. The way his gaze had seen straight through her defenses. Past the armor she had built, to the heart she had sworn was buried for good. It terrified her, and it angered her, but it also stirred something long forgotten. Something alive. By morning, the town buzzed with talk of the stranger. The blacksmith claimed he had seen scars along the man's hands, the kind earned in fights a man barely survives. The store clerk said he spoke little but paid in coins heavier than any local currency. Some swore he was running from something. Others whispered he was chasing something. Whatever the truth, the widow could not push him from her mind. When she stepped outside to fetch wood, she caught herself scanning the street, half expecting to see him standing there, watching her. She hated herself for it. She hated the weakness it stirred. And yet she could not deny it. By the third day, he was still in town. Folks were uneasy, but he kept to himself, working in the livery, fixing a broken wheel for a passing freighter, paying his way without complaint. He was a man who seemed to know his hands were made for labor, and his silence was made for secrets. But when he finally crossed her path again, the world seemed to hush. He tipped his hat, his voice low when he spoke a simple greeting. It was the first time she had heard his voice, deep and calm, carrying the weight of miles traveled and battles fought. She gave no reply, only nodded, her throat tight. Her heart beat too fast, and she turned away quickly, afraid of what might show in her face. That night, she did not sleep. The wind howled against the walls, rattling shutters and stirring old memories she had long buried. She told herself she could shut him out like she had done with all the others, but deep down, she knew this was different. His presence was a challenge, one she had never faced before. Every man before him had asked something of her, her hand, her home, her trust. This man had asked nothing at all. And yet, with just one glance, he had already taken more than she had ever been willing to give. The widow's pride battled with her heart as the days passed, each encounter tightening the knot between them. Though no words were spoken beyond necessity, the townsfolk watched with hungry eyes, sensing a story about to unfold, one that could not be stopped. Whispers spread like smoke, and speculation clung to every corner. Would she finally bend? Would the stranger stay? No one knew. But the tension grew thick as the snow deepened, and even the air seemed charged with the weight of something inevitable. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of fire and ash, the widow stood alone on her porch. The cold bit at her skin, but she did not feel it. She was waiting without admitting it to herself. Then, across the street, the saloon door swung open. He stepped out, hat low, coat brushing the snow, his stride steady and sure. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, and their eyes met again in the gathering dusk. This time, he did not look away. He started walking toward her, each step measured, unhurried, and final. She gripped the railing, her breath caught in her chest, knowing that whatever happened next would break the life she had fought so hard to hold together. And he stopped at the bottom of her steps. The silence so deep it seemed even the wind held its breath. He lifted his head, his eyes locked on hers, and for the first time since she had buried her husband, her heart betrayed her. It beat not with grief or anger, but with something terrifyingly alive, something she had sworn she would never feel again. The stranger opened his mouth to speak, and in that charged moment, she realized her world was about to change forever. The stranger's voice was rough, touched by miles of dust and silence, and yet it carried with it a weight that made her grip the railing harder. He did not speak much, only a greeting, simple as the earth beneath their boots. But it was enough to unsettle her more than any fine speech could have done. For years she had lived in the quiet company of grief, turning away men who came with promises of shelter and steadiness. But this man asked nothing. His eyes did not plead or demand. They simply looked into hers as though he had already found something he had been searching for across countless roads. She gave no reply. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she turned her gaze away, her heart hammering against the silence. He did not press her. He did not climb the steps or force himself into her world. He only tipped his hat once more and stepped back into the dusk, his figure swallowed by the growing shadows. When the saloon doors creaked shut behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fire in her chest burned strangely, a mix of fear, anger, and something dangerously close to longing. The next morning, whispers moved faster than the frost across the windows. The townsfolk always had a way of knowing when something stirred out of the ordinary. The widow had seen his eyes, and he had looked at her in a way that did not go unnoticed. Women at the mercantile exchanged knowing glances, while men muttered about how no stranger should come here, thinking he could unsettle what had long been settled. The blacksmith said he had the look of a man who had done more than just drift from town to town. The preacher warned that a soul with secrets could bring more ruin than redemption. Yet for all their talk, none dared confront him. There was something in the quiet power of his stance, the way his shoulders carried not just his coat, but a history too heavy to name. She tried to bury herself in work. There was always enough of it to keep the body weary and the mind too tired to wander. The woodpile needed splitting, the barn roof sagged under snow, and the hens had to be coaxed through the bitter cold. Yet even as her hands labored, Her thoughts returned to him. She hated it. She told herself it was foolishness, that she had not endured years of solitude just to lose her footing to a man she did not know. Still, the memory of his eyes, steady and unyielding, haunted her more than the sharpest winter wind. At the inn, the stranger kept to himself. He ate in silence, nodding only when spoken to. He paid in silver coins that none in town had seen in circulation before, leading to rumors that he carried wealth earned in places men seldom survived. Some said he was a drifter running from the law. Others claimed he was a gunslinger waiting for his past to catch up to him. A few thought he might be a man with no home left, no family to return to, wandering until he found something that felt like belonging. Whatever the truth, his presence stirred the town in ways no one could control. One evening, when the widow went to fetch water from the well, she caught sight of him again. The street was quiet, lanterns glowing soft against the snow. He was there, leaning against the hitching post, his hat tipped low, as though he had been waiting without saying so. Her steps faltered, and for a moment she considered turning back, but pride kept her moving forward. He straightened, eyes lifting to meet hers, and once more the world seemed to narrow into a silence that swallowed everything else. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply watched her, as though every movement she made mattered more than the passing of time itself. She lowered the bucket, her hands shaking only slightly, and for the first time she forced herself to speak. Her voice came out softer than she intended, asking if he meant to stay long in town. He answered with the same quiet strength she was beginning to recognize, saying only that he stayed where the road ended. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her with questions heavier than the bucket of water she carried home. Days stretched on, each one marked by this strange pull between them. The town continued its guessing games, trying to fit the stranger into a story that made sense. But the truth remained hidden behind his silence. The widow fought against herself, telling her heart that it was foolish to be drawn to a man who might vanish as quickly as he had come. Yet every time their paths crossed, she felt the same unsteady shift within her. He did not court her. He did not seek her out with flowers or promises. He simply existed in her world. And somehow that was more dangerous than any pursuit. Winter storms rolled through the valley, fierce and unrelenting. The widow worked harder than ever, mending fences, feeding stock, and keeping her small home from collapsing under the weight of snow. It was on one of those bitter nights, when the wind howled so fiercely it seemed the world itself was breaking, that a knock came at her door. Her heart leaped, though she did not want to admit why. When she opened it, he stood there, snow clinging to his coat, his breath rising in white clouds. He said little, only asked if she needed help securing her barn against the storm. She hesitated, torn between pride and the gnawing truth that she could use another pair of hands. Finally, she stepped aside. He moved past her with the quiet surety of a man who knew his way around hardship. Together they battled the storm, securing doors, tying ropes, and checking the animals. Not once did he try to take control or lessen her strength. He worked beside her, as though he knew she would not have it any other way. When the work was done, and the barn held steady against the wind, they stood in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. She wanted to thank him but could not bring herself to speak. He nodded once, a gesture that carried more meaning than words, then turned back toward the storm. For a moment she thought he might vanish into the night, just as he had appeared from it. But he looked over his shoulder, his gaze steady on hers, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet again. The next morning, rumors spread fast. Some said he had spent the night at her home. Others whispered that she had finally opened her door to a man. None knew the truth, but gossip was as much a currency as coin in a town that small. The widow felt the weight of every eye upon her when she went into town, yet she did not defend herself. She held her head high, her pride burning as fiercely as the storm had. But inside, she wrestled with a fear she could not name. For the first time in years, her world was no longer locked away. The walls she had built were cracking, and the man who had stirred it all walked the streets as though he had always belonged. There, the stranger's story remained hidden, but it lingered at the edge of every conversation. He bore scars on his hands, marks that hinted at a past of violence or labor no one dared ask about. His eyes carried shadows, the kind that only come from loss or war. He never drank too much, never gambled recklessly, never raised his voice. Yet the sense of danger clung to him, subtle but sharp. The widow found herself wondering late at night who he truly was, what roads had brought him here, and why fate had set his path across hers. The thought unsettled her, but it also kept her awake, her heart restless in ways she could not control. She told herself she would not bend. She told herself no man could break what grief had left behind. But every day, every glance, every quiet moment between them tested the strength of that promise. The stranger was not like the others who had come knocking. He did not ask. He did not push. And somehow, that was what made him dangerous. Because without asking, he had already begun to take hold of the one thing she had sworn never to give again. The days grew heavier as winter dragged on, and the stranger's presence in town began to stretch like a shadow no one could ignore. Folks might not have known his name, but they felt his weight. The way he moved among them without asking permission, the way his silence spoke louder than the chatter around him. In small towns, strangers were either passing through or planning to stay, and both carried their own dangers. He had lingered too long to be brushed off as a man chasing work. People wanted answers, and answers were the one thing he refused to give. The widow sensed it too. Each time she stepped out of her home, she felt the air tighten, as if the whole valley was waiting for something to happen. The stranger had unsettled her in ways she didn't want to admit, but now it seemed he was unsettling the town itself. The men grew sharper in their stares, their hands twitching closer to belts and buckles. The women whispered more openly, some with pity for her, others with judgment, a few with envy. For years, she had been untouchable, turning away suitors with a glance. Now she stood at the center of attention, not because of her own choice, but because a man who carried his secrets like iron chains had looked at her in a way no one else dared. Tension thickened when trouble drifted in from outside the valley. A small band of riders had been seen on the far ridge. Men who carried rifles slung low in laughter that didn't sit right with honest folk. The sheriff said they were likely drifters, maybe outlaws, maybe not, but his tone lacked conviction. He was an older man, weary and cautious, not eager to stir up a fight unless he had no choice. The blacksmith swore. One of them had a face he remembered from a wanted poster years back. Whether it was true or not, fear spread faster than truth ever could. And in the center of that fear stood the stranger. A man people didn't trust enough to call a friend, but whose presence made them wonder if danger had come searching for him. The widow tried to push the unease aside, but it clung to her. She saw it in the way townsfolk crossed the street when he walked by, in the way children were pulled back by their mothers when he passed. It wasn't that he threatened anyone. He hadn't raised a hand, hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't spoken out of turn. But there was something in his stillness, something in his watchful eyes, that told people he was no ordinary traveler. And though they wouldn't say it aloud, most believed trouble would follow him the way a wolf follows blood in the snow. At night, she lay awake by her fire, the wind rattling the shutters as her mind spun. Part of her feared they were right. She had lost once before, lost everything she had loved, and she knew better than to welcome danger into her home. But another part of her couldn't let go of the way his presence lit something alive in her chest. Something she had thought dead forever. It was madness, she told herself. Madness to even think of him as anything but passing shadow. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she saw him standing in the storm, steady beside her as the wind tried to tear the barn apart. She remembered the sound of his voice, the way it rumbled low and sure. And she hated how badly she wanted to hear it again. The conflict stretched wider when the saloon became the center of a quarrel. One of the ranch hands, fueled by whiskey and jealousy, made the mistake of taunting the stranger. He accused him of hiding from the law, said men like him came only to stir ruin and leave behind broken hearts. The widow wasn't there to see it, but word spread fast. They said the stranger didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at the man, a look so sharp it silenced the room. Then, without a word, he walked away, leaving the ranch hand red-faced and trembling with a fury he couldn't control. The fact that he hadn't fought back only made the whispers grow louder. Some said it was proof he was dangerous, that a man with that much restraint could strike twice as hard when he finally moved. Others thought it meant he had nothing to prove. And that was more unsettling than anything else. The widow found herself caught between two worlds. On one side stood the town, watching her with suspicion, ready to blame her for whatever might come. On the other side stood the stranger, silent and unreadable, yet bound to her now in ways neither of them had chosen. She hadn't invited his glance, hadn't asked for his help, but she couldn't forget either. Each time she saw him across the street, each time she heard his boots on the boardwalk, her heart shifted against her will. It wasn't love. It wasn't trust. It was something raw or more dangerous. Like standing on a riverbank knowing the ice could break at any moment but still leaning closer to the edge. The riders on the ridge drew nearer, their presence now impossible to ignore. They weren't the kind of men who passed quietly. Livestock went missing. Smoke rose where no campfires should be. A freight wagon was found ransacked, the driver left battered on the trail. The sheriff called for men to ride patrol, but few volunteered. Fear had sunk too deep, and each time trouble touched the edges of town, eyes turned toward the stranger, silent questions hanging in the cold air. Did he know them? Were they here for him? Or was it fate playing a cruel trick, bringing danger and desire together in the same breath? Subplots began to tangle in the background. The ranch hand who had been humiliated in the saloon carried a grudge that burned hotter with each passing day. He had wanted the widow's hand for himself once, and though she had turned him away like all the rest, he couldn't stomach the thought of her being drawn to a man who had given nothing but silence. His pride festered, and he spoke louder in corners, trying to stir others into standing against the stranger. Men like him were dangerous not for their strength, but for their need to prove themselves. Pride could drive a man to foolishness faster than whiskey ever could. Meanwhile, the preacher's wife began visiting the widow more often, under the guise of kindness, but her questions always circled back to the same point. Had the widow spoken to him? Did she know who he was? Did she understand the kind of sin a woman might bring upon herself by opening her heart to a stranger? The widow answered little, her patience fraying with each visit, but the words stuck in her mind when she tried to sleep. Every angle seemed to press against her, from jealousy to gossip to fear. She had spent years mastering solitude, and now the walls of that solitude were being pushed on all sides. Leaving her no room to breathe, the stranger himself gave nothing away. He worked where he was asked, never lingering longer than needed. He spoke little, but his eyes saw everything. And sometimes she caught him watching her with a steadiness that made her knees weak. He had not asked for her trust, had not promised her anything. And yet, she felt the storm of her life circling closer because of him. And in that storm lay the true conflict she could not escape. It wasn't just about the town or the riders on the ridge or the whispers in the saloon. It was about the war inside her, the war between her pride and her heart, between the vows she had made to never bend again and the truth that part of her already had. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains and the snow caught fire in its last light, she saw him standing at the edge of town, staring toward the hills where the riders had been spotted. His shoulders were stiff, his posture sharp, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Fear twisted in her stomach. She knew then that whatever past he carried was not done with him, and if it found him here, it would find her too. She should have turned away, should have walked back inside her home and barred the door like she always had. But she stayed, her breath hanging in the cold air, watching him watch the horizon. And when he finally turned his head, his eyes locking with hers across the distance, she felt the world tighten like a rope pulled to taut. Ready to snap at any moment, the days that followed pressed down heavy on the valley, every sunrise bringing more unease than relief. The riders on the ridge had not vanished. They had grown bolder, letting themselves be seen in the distance. Their laughter carried on the cold wind, their fires glowing like watchful eyes against the dark hills. Cattle went missing again, and another wagon was turned over on the trail. The sheriff's warnings no longer soothed anyone. Men gathered in corners of the saloon, voices hushed, eyes darting toward the stranger, as if the answers lay in his silence. The widow felt it too, the way the entire town seemed caught in a breath it could not release. waiting for something to break. She told herself she could keep her distance, that she could shut the door against the storm like she always had. But her resolve was thinner now. Too many times she caught herself looking for him. Too many nights she lay awake wondering what shadows filled his past. Each glance they shared tied her tighter to him, whether she wanted it or not. And every whisper in town reminded her that people were watching, waiting to see if she would fall like any other woman. Pride battled with need inside her chest. The fight wore her down more than any long day's work ever could. Then came the evening when the saloon door slammed open, and one of the ranch hands staggered inside, face pale, blood on his sleeve. He claimed the riders had stopped him on the trail, said they weren't just thieves but men hunting something or someone. His words spread like fire. All at once, the room turned toward the stranger, who stood near the back, quiet as always. The ranch hand pointed a trembling finger, swearing the outlaws had asked questions about a man who fit his description. The silence that followed was sharper than a blade. The widow's breath caught as she imagined every thought flickering through the minds of those men. If the riders were here for him, then the danger wasn't circling the valley by chance. It was coming straight into their town. The sheriff finally stepped forward, voice rough but steady. He asked the stranger to explain himself, to say whether he knew those men or not. The room leaned in, desperate for answers. The stranger met the sheriff's gaze, then the widow's, and for the first time, his silence cracked. His words were simple, stripped bare. He said he had seen them before. He didn't deny it, didn't try to soften the truth. That admission was enough to set the room buzzing like hornets. Questions flew, accusations hissed, and in the middle of it all, the widow felt her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and something she didn't dare name. He had not confessed to guilt, but he had admitted to a tie. That was enough to set the whole town on edge. From that night on, suspicion grew like frost on every window. Some wanted him gone, claiming his presence was a threat too great to risk. Others argued they needed a man like him if trouble came riding into the valley. The widow heard both sides, but none of it eased the storm inside her. She wanted to know the truth, wanted to ask him directly, but fear kept her silent. Each time she saw him, the words caught in her throat, her pride holding them back. She could not bring herself to beg answers from a man who already had such a hold on her. The riders drew closer with each passing day. Horses were found slaughtered on the outskirts, fences cut, smoke trailing from homesteads abandoned in fear. The air itself seemed charged, heavy with the promise of violence. And always, in the center of it, was the stranger. He moved through town like a man already preparing, checking his horse, buying supplies, his eyes scanning the horizon more often than the street before him. He said little, but his silence now carried an edge, tension that told the widow he was not blind to what was coming. One night, unable to bear the questions gnawing at her, she confronted him. She found him at the livery, hands working a saddle by lantern light. The smell of leather and oil filled the air. Her voice trembled as she asked him what those men wanted, why they had followed him here. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then he lifted his head, eyes meeting hers, with a weight that nearly buckled her knees. He told her they were men he had crossed long ago, men who lived by violence and would not rest until old scores were settled. He did not speak of details, did not tell her what he had done or why, but she could see the truth in his face. He had been shaped by battles no words could soften, and those battles had now reached her doorstep. Her pride wanted to send him away, to demand he leave before more ruin came. But the words would not come. Instead, she found herself gripped by fear, not for herself, but for him. She hated the weakness of it, hated how her heart betrayed her vow to never feel again. Yet there it was, raw and undeniable, binding her to him even as danger pressed closer. The town grew restless. The ranch hand, who had once quarreled with him now, stirred others to anger, rallying men with promises that they must defend themselves before the riders struck first. Some listened, others wavered, but the tension grew sharp enough to break. The widow heard their talk and knew it would end badly. Fear made men foolish, and pride made them reckless. And if they turned against the stranger before the outlaws even arrived, blood would spill in their own streets. As winter deepened, so did the storm inside her. Each night she waited, heart racing at every sound outside her window, torn between the hope that he would come and the fear that he would leave. Each day she worked harder, trying to bury herself in routine, yet her thoughts betrayed her again and again. She had survived years of loneliness by building walls around her heart. But now those walls cracked, and she could not hold them steady. The stranger had not asked for her trust, had not sought her hand, yet he had taken something far greater without a word. And she hated him for it as much as she longed for him. The riders made their first open move when smoke rose from a cabin just beyond the valley. By the time anyone reached it, the place was ash and ruin, the family gone, their fate uncertain. The town was thrown into panic. Mothers gathered their children close, fathers sharpened tools and checked rifles. The widow stood on her porch that evening, watching the smoke drift against the mountains, knowing in her bones that the storm had finally broken. When she looked toward the edge of town, she saw him there, sitting his horse, eyes fixed on the hills. The sight made her chest tighten until she could hardly breathe. That night, as darkness swallowed the valley, lanterns glowed in nearly every window. The streets were quiet, too quiet, the silence stretched thin with dread. Men gathered with rifles, the sheriff pacing with lines of worry carved deep into his face. The ranch hand raised his voice, calling for the stranger to be forced out, claiming his presence was a curse that had brought the outlaws upon them. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The widow felt her hands clench at her sides. Her pride told her to stay silent, to let them decide their own course. But her heart thundered with the truth she didn't want to face. She was bound to him now, bound to the storm he carried, and no amount of denial would change it. As the argument reached its peak, the sound of hooves broke through the night. Every head turned toward the darkness beyond town. A line of figures emerged, torches burning in the cold wind, the riders' laughter carrying across the frozen ground. The outlaws had come at last, bold and unafraid, riding straight toward the heart of the valley. Rifles were raised, voices hushed, and the widow felt her knees weaken as she realized the moment had come. All the whispers, all the fear, all the waiting had led to this. The stranger stood apart from the crowd, silent and still, his hand resting near his side. His eyes locked on the approaching riders. He looked neither surprised nor afraid, only resolved, as though he had been waiting for this night all along. The widow's breath caught as she watched him. Every part of her screamed that she should run, should bar her door and hide from the violence about to unfold. But her feet stayed rooted, her eyes fixed on him, as though her fate was tied to his now, no matter the cost. The riders slowed their horses at the edge of town, torches flickering, rifles gleaming in the firelight. Their leader pushed forward, his voice rough as he called out into the night, demanding the stranger be handed over. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Every man in town looked between the sheriff, the stranger, and each other, torn between fear and pride. The widow's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break. The stranger did not move. He simply stood, tall and steady, his shadow cast long against the glow of the torches, as though the weight of the whole valley now rested on his shoulders. The storm that had torn through the valley left behind a silence that felt almost sacred. The wind was gone, the clouds had broken, and the mountains stood clear against the pale dawn sky. The widow stepped out onto her porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes searching the horizon for the stranger who had unsettled her life in ways she had never imagined. For the first time in years, she felt her heart beating with both fear and hope, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling more than grief and duty. He had gone into the hills with nothing but his horse and his gun, chasing down the men who had brought ruin to the town. Folks had whispered that no one could stand against them, that they were too many and too ruthless. But the stranger had not flinched. He carried himself with the quiet resolve of a man who had seen enough death to know it was not something to fear, it was only something to face. She had tried to stop him, her voice trembling as she begged him not to ride out alone. But he had only touched the brim of his hat and given her that look, the one that made her chest tighten and her breath falter. Through the long night, she had prayed, though she had not prayed in years. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of the coyotes, every gust against the shutter had made her heart leap, fearing the sound of hoofbeats that never came. But as dawn broke, the valley held its breath, and in the distance she finally saw him, riding slow, his coat torn, his hat low, but still in the saddle. Her knees weakened, relief washing over her. Though she could not yet see if he carried wounds or worse, by the time he reached the yard, the widow had hurried to meet him. His horse was lathered and limping, and his face bore the weight of battle. Blood stained his sleeve, and dust clung to every line of his frame. Yet his eyes were steady, and when they met hers, it was as though all the storms had cleared. She wanted to speak, but words caught in her throat. He dismounted with effort, his jaw tight, but he refused her hand when she reached for him. He stood tall, as if needing her to see that he had not been broken. Only when she placed her palm against his chest did she feel the shudder of his breath and the truth of his pain. He let out a low laugh, not one of joy, but of weariness, and allowed her to lead him inside. There, by the fire that still burned from the night before, she tended his wounds. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was no longer sharp with uncertainty. Instead, it carried an understanding that something had shifted. Something both of them had fought against, yet could no longer deny. The town was safe again, or as safe as any place could be on the edge of the frontier. The men who had terrorized it were gone, and with their absence, a weight lifted from every household. People looked to the stranger with gratitude, but he did not linger among them. He returned to the widow's cabin not as a conqueror seeking reward, but as a man who had found something worth staying for. Folks noticed, and whispers began to circle. They said the widow, who had turned away every suitor since her husband's passing, no longer stood so alone on her porch. Still, old fears clung to her. She had built her life on self-reliance, her heart armored against loss. To open it again was to invite the risk of losing everything she had barely managed to hold together. But each day, as the stranger mended fences, split wood, or simply sat beside her with quiet company, she felt the weight of her solitude ease. He never pressed her, never asked more than she could give. But in his steady presence, she found herself wanting more than the safety of silence. One evening, as the sun set fire across the mountains, he spoke with a gravity that pulled her heart taut. He told her of the places he had wandered, the wars he had fought, and the graves he had left behind. His life had been a road without end, marked by dust and sorrow. But here, he said, he had found something different. He did not call it love, though the word hung unspoken between them. Carried in the warmth of his gaze and the way his hand brushed hers, he said only that he wanted to stay if she would have him. The widow felt tears burn her eyes, for she knew the cost of such a choice. To let him stay was to risk her heart again, to risk the pain of losing him to bullets, to sickness, to the cruel hand of fate. Yet she also knew that to send him away would be to turn from the one thing her heart had yearned for all these empty years. Her voice trembled when she answered, but it was steady enough to carry the truth. She told him she did not need a man to keep her safe, but she wanted him here all the same. That night, as the firelight flickered against the walls of the cabin, the widow finally set aside her fear. She did not think of the men she had turned away, or the years she had spent locked in grief. She thought only of the stranger, who had walked into her life and undone all the walls she had built with nothing more than a glance. The mountains outside stood as silent witnesses, the stars above burning bright, as though they too knew that something rare had taken root in the heart of the valley. The story of the widow and the stranger became part of the whispers that carried through town, told over card tables and bar counters, spoken softly in church pews and at kitchen tables. Some called it fate, others called it folly, but those who saw them together knew better. It was not fate or folly, but choice. A widow who had sworn she would never open her heart again had chosen to let it live, and a man who had never stayed in one place had chosen to remain. Seasons turned, and the valley bloomed again. The widow no longer stood alone at the edge of her porch, her eyes scanning the horizon for something lost. Instead, she stood with him at her side, watching the world not with fear of what might be taken, but with hope for what could be built. The mountains still loomed, the storms still came. But within the walls of that small cabin, warmth and laughter grew where silence once reigned in the end. The tale of the widow and the stranger was not one of sorrow or even of struggle, though both had carved their paths. It was a story of what happens when broken lives find each other and decide to heal not apart, but together. It was a reminder whispered across the old American frontier that even in the harshest lands, where loss and danger lingered at every turn, love could still take root and grow strong enough to endure. And so, the widow who had refused every man found herself no longer defined by grief or guarded by walls. She had let a stranger into her life, and with him she found not only love, but the courage to live fully again. The valley held their story, etched in the quiet of the hills and the strength of the earth, a timeless truth carried forward in the hearts of those who remembered.